If you have a Bible and you'd like to follow along, please turn in it to Luke 13th chapter. This is where we will be spending our time today. I said to you guys a couple of weeks ago, I think it was last week actually, that in my work, when I'm operating a saw, I got a bench in front of me and I push the saw through, and of course the saw cuts a little gap in whatever I'm cutting and the splinters fall, and they inevitably wind up in the tops of my shoes because I work in shorts most of the time. And of course, when the splinters fall into my shoes, anybody who's ever done that for a living realizes that sooner or later some of those splinters turn sideways in the sock. They get caught in the fibers of the sock, turn sideways, and so if I've cut a piece of trim and I've all of a sudden got one of those in my sock sideways, as I go back into a house where I'm working to carry that piece of trim inside or whatever it is I'm doing, all I can think about is sitting down after I put that piece of trim up and getting that splinter out of my sock. That's the only thing that's on my mind. I don't care about anything else. It's just so irritating. Well, the gospel is like that. The gospel is like that. Let's stop and think about that for a few minutes. Before I was born again, and I don't know if any of you can remember that, I can. I would sit in church because I was in an unbelieving family. Neither of my parents were believers, and they forced us to go to church. Anyway, my dad did because he was concerned that my grandparents, who were believers, would be really angry if they didn't see their grandchildren in church. So I would sit there, and every time I listened to the speaker, the Sunday school teacher, whoever it was, talk about the gospel of Jesus, it irritated me no end. And then if I went to my grandfather's house, I could never be with him that he didn't say to me, "What are you going to do with Jesus, Rip?" Like that's a question I want to talk about when we're out here fishing or whatever it was we're doing. So the gospel is like that. It's like the splinter in the shoe that just will not be left behind until something happens that deals with it in some way. Let's take a look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 31. At that time, some of the Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, "Leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you." Jesus replied, "Go tell that fox, I drive out demons and heal people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I'll reach my goal. In any case, I've got to keep going today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem." "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," Jesus said as he looked at the city, "you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you, how often I would have gathered you together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. Look, your house is left to you desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say openly, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So here's Jesus in this particular time and space doing what he does. And he is completely fearless. I mean, we have to realize the time in which Jesus is saying these things. We don't have anything, we talked about it, Nancy mentioned it a few minutes ago. Isn't it great to live in this country? And it is. We can say what we want, we can think what we want, we can do pretty much what we want is within reason. But at this time in history, you couldn't say stuff like this. You couldn't talk about Herod in this way. If it were found out, look at John the Baptist, what happened to him, right? He had something negative to say about the fact that Herod had his brother's wife as his own. And people didn't like that. And so Herod had him brought into the Mamertine prison, kept there until he finally took his head off. Don't think for a second that isn't possible here. Jesus is saying things that place him in deep jeopardy. He says things against the Pharisees, he says things against the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians, all these important Jewish people, and Herod himself. And so at every step, Jesus is saying things that are dangerous for him to say. They're very dangerous for him to say. And Jesus is moving through the countryside. This just strikes me as so incredible. For 3 years, he's been moving around with the kind of scrutiny that would just about kill anybody. I mean, one of the nicest things for me when I'm at my job is when I'm in the house, let's say the house I'm working in now, and I hear the homeowner's car crank up because they're leaving. Now, Al, you've done this for a living, and you know what it feels like when finally the person who is living in the home, who owns the home, is leaving the home, and you can be there by yourself and just do your work and not be concerned about it. Or, I remember when I was working in retail, one of the places I worked, the owner of the store had a two-way mirror in his office, a big one, at the back of the store. And I couldn't see in there, but he could see out. And I never knew whether he was in there or not. So it meant that I was under a kind of a scrutiny all the time. That's really hard. I mean, have you ever been somewhere where you're doing something that you may be really good at, you know how to do it, there's no question that you're competent, but you got somebody standing over you who's in charge, who's just looking at you the whole time. That's terrible. Well, Jesus has spent 3 years now doing that, with everybody in the entirety of the culture that wants him dead, watching him very carefully to see if he can say something or do something that would give them the occasion to accuse him and call him out. But then Jesus is in an historical setting that is utterly orchestrated and crafted. Think of it. They're in a time called Pax Romana. That's the peaceful Rome. That means that within the bulk of the Roman Empire, except out on the fringes, there's no war. They're not being attacked by a foreign power. It's kind of like us right now, right? I mean, that's what made 9/11 such a shock, because we just don't expect things like that here. I don't expect to see tanks come rolling up Jim Mixon Road in the next 5 minutes. I guess it could happen, but I'm not looking for it. I'm not looking for jets to come streaking over and drop bombs all over the churchyard and on potentially us. None of that I'm worried about. This is the situation Jesus was in the Roman Empire. It's Pax Romana, the peaceful Rome. Further, you've got Herod sitting on the throne, Herod Antipas. Herod has had John the Baptist put to death. That's a terrible thing. But because of that, you see, Herod pleased the scribes and the Herodians and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the high priest and all the Jewish officialdom when he had John the Baptist put to death. He did. They were pretty happy about that because John the Baptist was weird and he was a troublemaker. But he didn't make the people happy at all. The people loved John. Scripture says that. So, Herod now, with Jesus can say stuff like this, and Herod's going to leave him alone because he knows that he wants to please the people. And so Jesus can move about very freely and do a lot of things that wouldn't be possible in another historical setting that he can do here. Think about Esther. Scripture says in the book of Esther, did you know Esther doesn't mention God once? The whole book? Go through and read it. You won't find God mentioned one time. In the book of Esther, the scripture says, who knows, Esther, that you're not here for such a time as this. Here's Esther, this Jewish woman. She's brought into Ahasuerus' harem, the king of Persia. She comes into his harem, which is not a good thing, but then again you have to realize the historical setting. She becomes the queen underneath King Ahasuerus. And there comes that point where she reaches out and touches the scepter of his scepter and says, will you preserve my people? She could not have made that request had she not been in that spot, at that time, at that place, at that historical moment, such that she could do that. And Jesus is in the same, God is doing stuff. This is no accident that Jesus is at this time, at this point in history, in this place. And further, think about it. Jesus has traveled all over Galilee and Palestine. Why? Because the Roman roads are there. They got this incredible road system that didn't exist until the Romans installed it. So there's a lot going on here that says that Jesus is at a very orchestrated time in human history, that these things had to happen when they happened because God wanted this setting of history to be established so that they could happen in the way that they did. And Jesus is just moving through his life. You know, what strikes me about Jesus and the way that he speaks here is, for us, when we talk this way, go tell that fox. That was not a nice thing to say about Herod. In that culture, to call someone a fox was very uncomplimentary. You were calling them a conniving scoundrel. You don't say that about the king. You just don't. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, one of the conversations, I don't know if you remember your third grade, fourth grade schoolyard conversations, but one of the really fascinating conversations we used to have was some kid would say this. He'd say, you know, if you say something bad about the president, they'll arrest you. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true, right? That's true, right? It is. Isn't that true? If you openly speak of the president in such a way as to threaten the president, and they find out about it, they're going to come and get you. And that was a fascinating schoolyard conversation. This is way worse for Jesus to speak this way. But you'll notice something else too that fascinates me is that Jesus doesn't say this like a chip on his shoulder. We do, right? If somebody cuts us off in traffic, or somebody barges in front of us in the grocery aisle, or somebody says something we don't like about ourselves, or we think about somebody who wrongs us in some way, we throw our chest out, we make all kinds of declarations about it. I'll tell you what will happen to them, right? That's how we are. I'll tell you what, if they did that to me, right? We love that kind of conversation. You don't see that here in Jesus. He's just saying things like they are, and he's moving through life with undeterred steadiness. He doesn't care about the time frame. All he cares about is doing what he's supposed to do that minute in that day. And he's just going to do it. And none of what's going on around him matters. There's no chip on his shoulder. I remember when I first was here in Manor as the pastor here, and I would drive the single-lane highway, and there was this guy. I got behind him, I don't even know how many times. I got to where I knew the car. He would go 47 miles an hour all the way from Waycross to Manor. And then, of course, he kept on going to Homerville at 47 miles an hour. He didn't even have to slow down in Manor because he's already going close to the speed limit anyhow. And when it's two lanes back then, man, your 47 is close enough to 55 that I really had to weigh in my mind where I caught up to him, and it was the same car. Where do I catch up to him, and is it worth it? If I pass him here, I'm only going to be about 30 seconds closer to Manor by the time I get there, so is it even worth passing the guy? 47 is so close to 55, I might as well just follow him. But it's so frustrating. It didn't matter how close I got behind the guy's bumper. It didn't matter if I flashed my lights. It didn't matter what I did. I could even give him the digital salute through the windshield. It wouldn't make any difference to him. He's just going to go 47 miles an hour. That's kind of like the way Jesus is. It's irritating to be around somebody who is so certain about what they're doing, so certain of their calling, and so committed and so understanding of everything around them that they're undeterred by anything. You ever get around people like that? It's irritating to some degree. They're not, there's no chip on their shoulder. They just are doing what they do. And they're not going to be bothered by anything around them. It's the way Jesus is. And then I look at this situation, and you see a further situation down the pike where Jesus stands in front of Herod, sure enough. You know, here he's just saying, look, you go tell the fox whatever he can come out here and watch me do what I'm doing. But there is a point at which Herod sees Jesus standing in front of him, and Jesus doesn't say anything at all. Can you imagine what that would feel like? I mean, if you knew who Jesus was, that you or I would be brought before Jesus, and he would stand and look at us and say nothing? I don't think that would be a good feeling at all. I'd want him to say something. But he stands in front of Herod and says nothing. Who's on trial? It's not Jesus. It's not Jesus. So you can see that God has moved history. He's moving all kinds of pieces into place to bring Jesus to the moment at which he does enter Jerusalem, and then everything that comes forward beyond that begins to happen. All the machinery is put into place. But this passage is one of those almost miraculous ones where you see Jesus showing us something about himself that you couldn't know if this weren't here. He stands in front of Jerusalem and speaks to it in a way that is just unbelievable. how often I would have gathered you. What is he saying? Well, he's saying maybe he was there before a month ago, or maybe he's saying maybe he was there 1,000 years ago. And that he did try to gather them, and they would not. You remember in Romans, Paul quotes Isaiah and says, quoting God, how often I spread my hands out to a stiff-necked people. That's exactly what Jesus is referring to. And he's just going to continue doing what he's doing, and nobody's going to deter him. And he's moving towards something that he knows is coming. He knows what he's headed for. I mean, he's prophesied it already. You'll see the Son of Man lifted up. He knows what's coming. Think about what it would be if you were a prisoner and you were sent to death row. All right? Give you the little cell. But every day, they want to make it really apparent that you've been a bad boy or girl, and that's why you're on death row. So we want to make it so that you feel it. Don't just bide your time. Every day they take you out, and they've got out in the prison yard a gallows. They got rope hanging from it. It's all set up for somebody, right? And they take you out of your cell every day, and they walk you 6 inches closer to it every day. Walk you out and let you stand there and look at it, and then take you back to your cell. And every day for 3 years, they walk you 6 inches closer to that gallows. And you know that you're the one that's going to be on it when you finally are marched up to it. That's the kind of situation that Jesus has been walking with for 3 years. He knows exactly where he's headed. But Jesus says in John, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up. And this is the command I received from my Father. Jesus knows all this stuff, but he also knows who's really in charge. Jesus is speaking, I think, in a way here that I can't speak for anybody else in this room. Everybody in this room, we heard it on the prayer request list, we have things that are in our lives that we wish weren't there. All of us. Bodily things, familial things, employment things, future things, security things, all of us. And yet, Jesus is telling us here that we can have a confidence in those things as we walk forward. There's a lot of uncertainty. We live in such a weird environment as human beings. We do. Think of it. Look at all the cars out there. A lot more than normal. That's nice. But look at all the cars. Every one of us who drove one here today got in it, cranked it up, got behind the wheel, and did something that we have utter confidence about, right? Nobody really fears to get behind the wheel. We don't get behind it just trembling, hope I survive the next 50 feet. We don't even think like that. We do it with the sense of confidence, just like we get up out of the bed in the morning, or we take a shower, or we brush our teeth, or we drink a glass of water. We do all these things, and yet life is not something we should be confident in at all. I remember a friend of mine, when I first started learning to drive, I said to him, and he laughed, he thought it was a joke. I said, once you get a car up past 35 miles an hour, you're just out of control. Anything could happen. He thought I was joking. I'm not joking at all. I still think that's true. I was reading an article this week in the news. A woman got out of her car, went to the grocery store, got her groceries, brought her groceries out, put them on the back deck of her SUV, the big clamshell lids that a lot of them have, raised it up, stood there, put her groceries in the car, backed away from the car to close the lid, and the lid wasn't fully up. Hit her head. She didn't think anything about it. Just a bump on the head. Closed the lid, drove home, made dinner, had the evening, and that night died in the bed from a brain bleed. That's just how easily this life can be very, very different for any of us. We have confidence in things that I wonder about. Jesus says to them here, your house is left to you desolate. He knows what's coming. He knows that there are going to be 10,000 Jews crucified on a dirt berm all the way around Jerusalem. where Titus the general crucifies them to try to he's laid siege to the city, and it's going to tear the temple down stone by stone right to the ground. Jesus knows all that. Yet these people are living in a sense of confidence that isn't deserved by this life. In the words of the songwriter, we cannot see tomorrow, for our lanterns are so weak. Storms behind us, we climb an endless peak. Our grip on your hand loosens, we cannot hold on for long. Your hand holds to our hand with a grip so sure and strong. Do you have dreams in your life that are broken? Do you have insecurities about tomorrow, the next day, the future? Do you have lost relationships, broken relationships in your life? Do you have hatreds that you can't cure yourself of? Do you have things in your life wherein you see yourself as perhaps doing damage to those around you and you can't stop it? Our lives are not where we would want them to be, none of us. And yet, we have the confidence of knowing that Jesus himself, the same one who was saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, walks with us. And nothing that passes into your life or mine doesn't pass through God first. And we can have that confidence in that Jesus will walk with us through whatever we face. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me about your life, speak with me about this church, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.